we will understand it better by and by. There are so many things in this life that some things we don't understand at all. Some things we understand somewhat, at least we think we do. Others we realize there's a vast world of understanding that we are aiming to dig into and to seek to understand it. And such is the world of, at least to me, when you think of personal evangelism, and especially also a title or a part of that is called Christian apologetics. When I first heard that term apologetics, I heard that from a friend of mine, and he must have read it on my face that I had a puzzled look. I had no idea what that was. And he said, "You know what that is, right?" And I said, "Yeah, it's how we as Christians are to be humble enough to apologize when we do wrong." It was sincere, but it was sincerely wrong. Christian apologetics is, actually, let me ask you, what is apologetics? What does it mean? Good, explaining the gospel, and also a dictionary defined it as follows: reasoned arguments or writings in justification or something, especially in religious doctrine and beliefs. So we give reason for the gospel. We give reason for something that we believe in. And sometimes, sadly, the way we do, or where Christians share the gospel, it almost comes across more of an apology than a sales pitch. Like, you've got to get this. If you miss this, you're missing the biggest thing in the world. It's almost like an apology. Sorry to bug you, but when it's the greatest message ever told, the greatest thing that we can ever embrace. And as Christians, we are called to be apologists. And 1 Peter 3, verse 15 to 16, there we have in the letter of the Apostle Peter, he tells us to be prepared. 1 Peter 3, 15 to 16. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that when they defame you as evildoers, those who revile your good conduct in Christ may be ashamed. The words here, to give a defense, in the original language is apologia. And that's where we get apologetics from. Christian apologetics. Christians giving a reason for the hope that is in them. Because we get labeled so often as you just go on blind faith, you have no evidence, you have no reasons, you just do it because you were told, do it because it's tradition. Apostle Peter back then, he says, don't do it just like that. Give them a reason. And I have the question box in the back, and I still encourage you, if you have more questions, please don't hesitate. Don't think that your question is not important enough, or if it's too hard, I'll say it's too hard. I don't know, but if you have a question, please don't hesitate. We had excellent questions come in. 2 questions were very close, very similar in nature. One was, is there actually proof that God is real? The other one was close. How do we know that God is real and not just something made up beyond tradition and feeling? Physical proof for God's existence beyond the Bible, because some don't believe the Bible. Excellent questions. Excellent questions. Because that's exactly what you'll run into when you go and make disciples. And as Christians among us, proof for God, we pull out the Bible and we have a plethora of evidence. But none of that sinks in the life and the heart of someone who grew up without the Bible. To them, he was always told, maybe even by his parents, the Bible is a myth. So how do we give reason in a genuine way, in a loving way, to someone who might be genuinely seeking for a good reason. So this morning, the title, Finding God in Science. Physical proof for God's existence. And by way of introduction, I think this is an area of apologetics, of giving reason is so important, because I'm mindful of when my wife and I were traveling home one time, we ended up, just because the way the seats were divided up, we didn't sit together, and she sat next to a college student in Edmonton, grew up in Edmonton, college student, 20-some years old. And in the conversation, he told my wife, he said, you know, I've never, ever met someone who really believes that the Bible is true, much less someone who can give me reasonable answers, a backup to why do they believe what they believe. That's Edmonton. That's, not anymore, but used to be a Christian country. So the Apostle Peter's encouragement to us, be ready to give an account, that includes you and me. Not that we have to become apologists officially and do, like some have the calling and do an excellent job, some of them at least, to take on some of these greatest agnostics and scientists, so to speak, but in a personal level, that we know what we stand for. God in science. First of all, just a few points by way of introduction that help us to build up what we're getting at. What is science? It has a very high-sounding place in our society. Well, I believe in science, or the scientists, right? So what is it? Science, by definition, at least according to one, is a human endeavor to discover the structure of the world and the laws that govern its workings. So it's a search for how does the world that we live in work? Science. And you know, there's been some fascinating discoveries that have been made about the world that we live in, from the macro to the micro, from the atom to the universe. Fascinating stuff. And the big question that is often, well, now it's not really a question anymore, it's often stated as a statement that the Bible and science are at odds. You can't combine them. Is that true? Absolutely not. While the Bible is not a science book, it's a book of faith. It is a book that gives us reason for our faith, and it has evidence, scientific evidence in it. It is not a science book, but it has way sufficient information in there for us to have solid footing, even beyond just faith, if you will. But we'll get more into that later. But this just suffice to say that the Bible is not contra science. It is contra many scientists, but not against science. And this then leads us to the conclusion that, and also the encouragement that, being a Christian does not mean you can't be scientific. We hear the label so often that, oh, if you're a Christian, well, you shut off your mind, really, when it comes to the scientific world. That's not true. That's not true. There are Christian scientists who are looking at creation from the perspective of, God has made this. How did he do it? How does it work? You can still study it and explore vast worlds in that. You don't have to shut off your mind. And if you look into the history, not that a lot of them, I don't know if any of them had the Christian belief, but to believe in a God. A lot of the very well-known scientists, they believed in at least a God. Galileo, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and so on. But we're not building our faith, our reason on what other people before us have said. That's not good enough, right? Because if they were wrong, then we were wrong. We need to give a reason so that we know what we're standing on. And as someone once said, and I like it, if a scientist agrees with the Bible, it doesn't give me more confidence in the Bible. It just gives me more confidence in the scientists. Because the Bible has been proven for 2,000 years. Scientists, how many of what these people have said has been changed? Oh, they were wrong. They looked at it wrong or didn't get it quite right. Some of the things still stand, but how many times have the science books been changed and revised? So being a Christian does not mean you can't be scientific. You definitely can. In fact, Proverbs 25 verse 2, there's a beautiful verse where the wise Solomon, who had such a vast understanding, and he did the study of the world around him, and it said, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings, it is to search out a matter. And that's how I see the glory of God, creation. And there is something revealing and glorifying to God when we can search out and do it with the right heart and say, look at what God made. Look at the details he put in. We have an awesome God. And that's can be very much scientific. They're not at odds with each other. Someone wrote, many skeptics think that Christianity is for people who do not want to think. Christians are often characterized as people who believe whatever they're told by the church. Faith is thought of as something that only believes blindly with no supporting evidence. However, this viewpoint does not represent biblical Christianity. In contrast to what many skeptics believe, the Bible challenges its readers to test everything and to give a reasonable conclusion. We think of 1 Thessalonians 5:21. Test all things. Hold fast to what is good. Test it. Find out, what do you have? Is that true? Is it real? Or is it just man-made things, traditions? Test it. Contrary to what is often said, we don't shut off our mind when we come to Christ. We're told to engage that renewed, sanctified mind in our daily life. And make it personal. So, always give reason for defense. Notice how personal he makes it. It doesn't say, always have your pastor's number handy that you can call, give them the number that he can call you. Although I want to say, call me at any time. The message is not that. The message is you. You have interaction with them. Have a reason for what you believe. So then how do we prove that there is a God to a generation who says there isn't, largely? And first, when we address this, we have to acknowledge there are some I want to call them problems in proving the way they are asking us to prove it. What do I mean by that? God is a spirit, and therefore he's invisible. And when they're talking about, we prove it, they're talking about something that they want to be able to put in a test tube and put in their lab and observe it. You can't do that. Because God is a spirit. You can't do that. And they look at the amazing galaxies, but there's no telescope that you can direct in a certain point in heaven and see the pearly gates of heaven. You can't. They can travel to the moon and back, but they don't have a shuttle that can travel to hell and back and say this is real. Even though hell is real. But they haven't done that, so therefore they claim it's not real. That's the kind of proof that they're often after. You can't put God in a test tube. And therefore a lot of them throw it out as it's not scientific, just blind faith. But he's a spirit. So how do you respond to a classmate, or worse, a teacher, professor, who, like Richard Dawkins, openly calls you, pardon me, stupid if you don't believe. How do you respond? How do you respond to someone who says, you know what, your faith is not based on evidence, it's based on just faith, what you've been told. And just before we get to that, one other thing we have to keep in mind is no matter what evidence you present to some people, they will still not believe. If you think of Jesus, the Son of God, who came down and revealed God to man, he healed the blind, he healed the sick, he brought people back to life. He himself rose from the grave. The soldiers that were paid for to guard his grave, they fell over as dead when that angel came. They came back to the people that hired and says, look, we were like dead, we were on the ground. Here's some money and just be quiet. That evidence couldn't have been more clear if someone slapped them in the face, and yet they denied it. So, when it comes to the evidence, we have to keep in mind there will never be enough evidence for everyone to, okay, I get it, because it's a way deeper issue. And the deeper issue always was and always will be, they don't want to be responsible for God, before God. And so when we speak about finding the evidence, I want to say for us, first and foremost, it is, yes, we are looking to get answers to questions, but it is also so that you and I have solid footing. When we are asked, when other people mock, we say, no, I know what I'm standing on, whether you believe that or not, but I see the evidence, I believe it, I am with Christ. And unless we think that only we have that problem of the postmodern world where people question everything, it's always been like that, just in different degrees, different levels. Apostle Paul already had people that said, prove it. Let me just read 1 Corinthians 1, verse 21 to 24. 1 Corinthians 1, 21 to 24. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through wisdom did not know God, it pleased God through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. Now, for the Jews, request a sign. Prove it. And Greeks, they seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks a foolishness. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. So back then already, Jews said, prove it. Jesus proved it. How much more proof did the Jews need? They still didn't believe. And the Greeks, those that were sincere, they believed when they saw all the evidence that was piled up. So, again, for us, we are looking at this as, first and foremost, a foundation for us, and then also a reason so that we can give a reason to others. Undeniable evidence of God's existence. And it is actually fascinating to learn that scientists now are agreeing that the universe had a beginning. I know they always talked about the Big Bang, but in essence they talked there, something was always there and then just something exploded. But let me just read what one apologist wrote. At the beginning of the 20th century, most scientists did not believe that the universe had a beginning. But now, about 98% of them do. All of today's evidence shows that the universe is constantly expanding and it's expanding. And if it's expanding, it must have had a beginning. So as they're studying the behavior of the planets, the stars, and how that is all moving, the cosmological constant, they say, wait a minute. Sort of like if we've ever, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you see maybe someone pops a water balloon and they videotape that with a very high-speed camera, and then you see how that it gets hit and then it just moves out like that, and then they put it in reverse and it looks very interesting. It all comes back to the same point. And that's sort of, and this is the picture that the secular world, the science, that's the most recent depiction of how they see it as. I hope you can see it on your right. there they see it as that's where it all happened. And then from there, it's moving at a constant rate that is sustained by itself. And they look at that, because we're moving now, that means if you back up, back up, back up, back up, there's got to be a point at which it started. And they're agreeing to that now. And I want to show you a video clip. This is a scientist who teaches, he is of Jewish background, so I can't verify that everything he teaches is in line. I don't know. But he teaches both from the Word of God and also science, and he explains how, and the title of this video is actually Science Has Proven the Existence of God. Let me just plug in the audio here. And I'll let him explain this graph or this map first, and then we'll sort of take some points from that.
One of the questions that I'm asked as a scientist is, how can a scientist really believe that there's something what we refer to usually as God? You know, is this metaphysical whatever acting in the world or producing the world? And the irony is, the question's really a non-starter. Science has, in fact, discovered God. And you can talk to the hardline atheists, and they will say, it looks like science has indeed discovered God. And how would that be? Well, if you take the trouble of going to the web, and they're typing WMAP, the initials for a satellite, it's a diagram that shows the development of the universe from the creation over time. It's a timeline. Every word on that diagram comes from the NASA site. It is the condensed knowledge of the scientific community of how the universe created and how it got to where we are today. Each of the lines, the vertical lines, is another billion years. Okay, you start from a burst of energy at the extreme left side of the diagram, and you end up at the far end with the oval. The oval is to indicate expansion in all directions. Of course, because it's a timeline, we can't show that on a single piece of paper. We see here, most amazingly, that on the extreme left edge, it shows a beginning to the universe. Now, go back less than 50 years. If I were teaching that at Tech, a person could lose tenure saying that there was a creation of the universe. It sounds like it's Bible. Because less than 50 years ago, the overwhelming scientific opinion was the universe is eternal. There was never a beginning. The Bible is wrong from the very first sentence. And then we discovered, suddenly, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, the Bell Labs in New Jersey, the northeast of the US, discovered the echo of the Big Bang, the energy left over, which George Gamow, 60 years ago, predicted that if there had been a universe created hot and small, it would have exploded, and the energy would get more and more dilute. And Penzias and Wilson, these Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, discover this energy that had been predicted overnight. The Bible got it right. There was a beginning to the universe. Now, the black in the diagram is nothing. It's not a vacuum. Vacuums are within that diagram, within that cone of expansion. Vacuums are empty space, and space is something. The black of the paper around the diagram is nothing. It doesn't fit in our human brain, because humans think in a box made of time, space, and matter/energy. No human, as clever as they might be, as expansive as they might be, thinks out of that box. So when we say outside that diagram is nothing, we can use the words, but we can't conceive of nothing. It doesn't fit in the human brain. How are we going to have this idea, is there a God or not? Notice that the creation force isn't a three-letter word, G-O-D. If you look at the words carefully, it's a quantum fluctuations. That understanding was first brought down by Ed Tryon, brilliant human being, in the journal Nature, almost 40 years ago. The universe allows creation of something from nothing, provided you have the laws of nature, the quantum fluctuation. Tryon realized, and he published in the journal Nature, one of the two leading peer-reviewed journals in the world, that you can create something from absolute nothing, provided you've got the laws of nature, quantum physics and the laws of relativity. In other words, the laws of nature. So look what science has discovered. We can create the universe from absolute nothing, provided we have the forces of nature. Now, the laws of nature, the forces of nature aren't physical. They act on the physical. So if they create the universe, that means they predate the universe. So now we have a set of forces, we call them the laws of nature, that are not physical, that are able to act on the physical. They create the physical from absolute nothing. And they predate the universe, which means they predate our understanding of time. Put that together, it sounds very familiar. If you haven't noticed it, that's the biblical definition of God. There's only one nuance that's left hanging. We can talk about it another time, perhaps. Is that which created the universe, those forces active in the universe. But up to that point, science says you are correct. The definition of the biblical God is predates time, outside of time. God is not a physical being, is a force, and it creates the universe. You'll notice at the opening chapter of Genesis, the only name for God is Elohim, God as manifest in the universe. Science has indeed discovered the biblical God. Well, we just need one part left, crucial. That which created the universe is also active in the universe itself. The very fact that you're watching this now pretty much establishes that point.
I found that to be very well put. And the sad part is they find the evidence, like I said, but they'll find another reason to explain it just so that they don't have to stand up to God. And I'm sure you caught that where, actually I'm getting ahead of myself. I will stick to my notes and we'll get to that. When you look at that, it makes a lot of sense where, and you see there is no contradiction. The Bible proves to be true and accurate over and over and over again. So some of the points that he mentioned and that are part of this undeniable evidence for God's existence is the fact that the universe is expanding. And I mentioned before, if it's expanding rapidly like that, then if you back up far enough, it had to start out somewhere. There had to be a beginning. And it's not just the fact that it's expanding right now. Oh, I see the time is flying. I have to go faster. That it's expanding right now, but it's also the rate at which it expands. Let me just read from what Apologetics wrote. Even the rate of expansion points to God. The rate is so perfectly fine-tuned that if it was changed at the beginning by 1 part in 10 to the power of 60, that's 60 zeros after it, 60, the universe would either be in chaos today or it wouldn't exist. If it was expanding that tiny fraction faster, matter couldn't hold together and we have no stars in the galaxies. It would just fly apart. If it was expanding a tiny bit slower, it would have collapsed long ago. And when I look at this, then I marvel at our God. When Joshua said, God, give me more hours of sunlight, God said, all right, here you go. What did he do all in that massive galaxy to empower that? What all did he have to stop and balance with his word? And nothing fell apart. When he said go, it continued the way it was before. Why? God's above that. Evidence for him being there. All the expansion and also the rate of which it all points to a creator, that also then points to the beginning. Notice on the chart from NASA, they call that beginning force quantum fluctuations. Any of the students of science know what that law talks about? What it claims or what it speaks of? What they define quantum fluctuations as? The quantum fluctuations is defined as the temporary change in the amount of energy in a point in space. So something happened. Yeah, In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. And they are agreeing that something can only be there if these laws are in effect. And we will hear, like he mentioned the phrase, and he had it up there, laws of nature predict. Oh, nature doesn't have laws. There's laws that nature obeys, but those are God's laws that he put in place for nature. But nature has laws that it follows, and that is why it was able to be, how God brought it into being. So Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. Makes sense. There was a beginning. What was that? Something like the definition of God is outside of it, outside of the universe, God. Acts upon it, God. Created something out of nothing, God. It's him. It's God. The only thing that makes sense is God. And Colossians 1 verse 15 to 16, he is the image, speaking of Jesus, the image of the invisible God. Invisible, outside, can't see him. The firstborn over all creations, for by him all things were created that were in heaven, that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. It makes sense. Reasonable deduction when you think of it. So science, there is irrefutable evidence for a creator, for God, the God of the Bible. It makes perfect sense. And that had to be a metaphysical, that a term, I thought I would mention it. What is metaphysical? What is that? I thought I mentioned it because you will hear it probably when you discuss with someone. There's the physical, we know what that is, right? The things that you can touch and feel. What's metaphysical?
Just something you cannot see.
Something you cannot see. Yes, that's part of that is, emotions, all these things, the consciousness and all that. Part of the metaphysical world, the metaphysical study is the study of where did we come from, why are we here, and so on, and also God. So metaphysical, just when you hear that phrase, don't be alarmed. And it's a high word for something that we all know what they're talking about. So undeniable evidence for a creator. And when we just rework that, by the way, when he talks about billions of years on those lines, we're not agreeing with that, obviously. But he is just taking a chart that they are using to use that chart against them, not that he comes up with his own, because then he says, oh yeah, that's yours, we don't believe it. He used their own and used that to explain how the Bible is true. But the years there, that's a different topic for another time. But just for the record, that is not what I'm preaching, that there's billions of years, just so that you're at ease when you leave. So one undeniable evidence is just cosmology, the universe, the moving, the creation, everything. Evidence, hard evidence in the science lab. There's so many others. I want to just stick to one at a time because there's probably enough information to chew on for now. But there's the complexity of the cells. There's the explanation of consciousness and emotion. How do you prove, where does that come from if it's just science and physical and so on? We decide what we do with the evidence that is presented. We all do. Everyone in this world does. And as mentioned, God has come down, and if you would have slapped him in the face, it wouldn't have been more obvious than when Jesus came. And Romans 1, verse 20 to 21 is a verse, or verses that are very fitting to how people dealt with the evidence that God gave. Romans 1, 18 to 23, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of man who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, there we have that again, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse, and so on. For time's sake, I won't continue reading. We know the passage. It is evident. And just to draw in some of the quotes from people that are not believers to see their conclusion. There's a man by the name of Robert Jastrow, was an American astronomer and a planetary physicist. He's a leading NASA scientist. Some of the quotes that he himself said. Scientists have no proof that life was not the result of an act of creation. But they are driven by the nature of their profession to seek explanations for the origin of life that lie within the boundaries of natural law. At least he's honest. Sadly, he claims to be agnostic and not a believer, but it's an honest statement. They're asking us for proof, and they don't have proof themselves. In fact, there's way more proof that there is a God than that there isn't. He continues in a different quote, there's a kind of religion in science. It is the religion of a person who believes there is order and harmony in the universe. This religious faith of the scientist is violated by the discovery that the world had a beginning under condition in which the known laws of the physics are not valid, and as a product of forces or circumstances we cannot discover. When that happens, the scientist has lost control. If he really examined the implications, he would be traumatized. That says it well. The reason they're denying it because that goes against everything that they stand for, despite the evidence. And then the last one, and that one to me, I was like, how can you say this and not believe God? But this is what he wrote in a book entitled God and the Astronomer, his own words. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountain of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. And as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. What he is saying is these people, they're working hard to prove something. At the end of their life, the final thing, the Bible's been right all along. They've been sitting right where we tried to get for a long time already. We just didn't acknowledge it. That's heart-wrenching when you look at it. On the soul, and you just wish, man, just take that extra step and say God is real. But we choose what we do with the evidence. We can't make people accept that evidence. They can't deny it. And there is a God, in conclusion. Sorry, it's a bit later, but I do want to conclude with this. You probably heard about this fiasco or this saga in Britain, where Dawkins and a few others, they founded this movement, and there's probably no God. Why probably, if you're so sure? And you know why? You know why? They wanted to say there is no God. You know why they changed that? They were afraid that they would be sued for false advertising if it would be proved wrong that there is a God. And so based on that, they said, okay, we'll put probably so that nobody can blame us for false advertising. And that, to me, that's such an empty thing. There's probably no God, so just enjoy life. How can you enjoy life on an uncertainty like that? There is a God. Enjoy life. He's brought us life because he has come. God is not a killjoy. He is the bringer and the giver of joy. We can stand firm. There is a God. Absolute, positive. Not just the tradition that our parents have brought us. Thank God for that. If it's biblical, we bless them for that. Beyond that, look around. God's invisible attributes are clearly seen in the things that are around us. Even science proves that, only we decide what we do with the evidence. We'll close there. And again, if you still have more questions, feel free to put them in the box. We'll continue on a different topic next time. I'd ask you to continue to pray for me as I prepare, that I would say it right, make it clear, and that I would have the answers, because I don't have all the answers. But let's pray and ask God for giving us courage to go and make disciples and give reason when we have opportunity.